Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first session of our 2018 webinar programme, tackling something never far from the front of all of our minds in Brexit, and more specifically, what exporters need to know about it in 2018. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I'm the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session, and you can ask questions at any point during the webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. Just a note to say that we have had lots of questions sent in advance to this webinar, so we won't be able to get to all of them. We'll try to answer a few of them on the site afterwards, and we'll group questions where possible. And I should also note that we will try not to ask too many political questions. The focus is very much on the practicalities of how Brexit may affect trade. We have a repeat of our fantastic lineup from last year's Brexit webinar, with Mathilde Murphy kindly joining us from Enterprise Europe Network to give tips on how businesses can plan in the short and long term, and also give an overview of some of the support that's out there for UK exporters looking to continue to export to Europe. And kicking things off, we'll have Mike Josipenko, who's been running the post-Brexit planning workshops for the Institute, among many other things, and we'll be giving an update on where the negotiations are and might be going. So over to you, Mike.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. Well, as Will mentioned, my name is Mike Josipenko. I work for the Institute of Exports. Thank you, Luby. So we're going to look at where we're at and what it means for businesses who are trading with Europe and beyond. And obviously, the political negotiation process has been in everybody's gaze in the media for the last few months. As just to recap, the exit process at the moment means that Brexit Day, the day when we leave the European Union, is going to be on 29th of March 2019, unless anything happens to change that in the meantime. We're in the middle of the negotiating stage and just agreed to move from phase 1 onto phase 2, which will deal with trade matters, but also will deal with the possibility of a transition or implementation phase. And important to bear in mind that that implementation or transition phase does have to be agreed by both parties, the UK and also the European Union member states. So it's nothing to take for granted, but you would think it's in everybody's interest to have it, but important that both parties agree on what format that will take. The EU's view is that it should be no more than around 21 months, and they've already stated that they want the transition phase to end by the 31st of December in 2020. The UK's view was that it should last 2 years, so not too much difference there. The EU is very much of the mind that it's a transition phase, and while the transition phase is ongoing, there will be a continuation of the status quo. So the UK would continue to enjoy all the benefits of being in the EU, but also would have all the obligations in being subjected to the European Courts of Justice, paying contributions to the budget, and also accepting free movement of people during the implementation and transition phase. Also worth bearing in mind that these are what the words mean. So they're intended to be phases to allow us to implement a change, rather than simply an extension to the existing negotiation process. Although in the finest tradition of EU negotiations, I wouldn't be surprised to see negotiations going either right to the wire and quite possibly beyond. So the cynics might tend to say that this does leave the door open for an extension to negotiations, but only if all parties agree. And as you'll be aware, the terms of any agreement that we make must be agreed both by Parliament in the UK, but more importantly with the European Council. And the European Council is the body that's made up of all the heads of state of the EU member states. And it doesn't have to be agreed in principle unanimously. The basic for an agreement is a qualified majority, and that is made up of 20 of the EU member states outside of the UK, but they must cover 65% of the overall population. So important that the key member states are included, such as Germany and France. If, however, we do go to a more complicated agreement, then it may have to be agreed further by each of the individual states. For instance, if the agreement that we settle on, hopefully a more complex one, does include matters which currently fall under the jurisdiction of individual countries, then it may require agreement by all member states, which could take longer and has more pitfalls for things to go wrong. So that's where we're at the moment. Next slide, please. So the UK government, going back a year now, has been fairly consistent in its approach. They've said that they want the freest and most frictionless trade possible with the European Union, but they don't want to be in the single market or in the customs union. So what does that mean in reality? Well, here's a quick summary of some of the features of both the single market and the customs union, because these are both terms that are used regularly by media, by commentators, and not necessarily with a clear idea of what they mean. So the single market is based on four elements. The free movement of goods, which is what most of us that deal in shipping of goods will be familiar with. So it's the regulation that allows goods to move from one EU member state to another without having to be inspected, without having to be physically stopped at the border points. It also means that there are no quotas or restrictions on quantities for goods moving, and no tariffs or non-tariff barriers, so no obstacles to trade with EU member states. It also gives us a common regulatory framework, so every member state has to adhere to common standards and regulations, whether they're trading in their own country or internationally. So that means that is not an issue when goods are moving within the countries. And if you look at the table, you'll see there are ticks and crosses. So the ticks in the column to the right of the single market represent the things which most business wants and which the government arguably wants, whereas the elements which are with a cross, sorry, are the ones which the political end of the spectrum are a little bit unreasonable. So as well as single market for movement of goods, the free movement of services is something that features the single market and is something that's very welcome by anybody that's selling services. Of course, the downside of the single market as far as the Brexit end of the political spectrum is concerned is that the single market does include the freedom of movement of people, which allows people to live or work in any member state. So while we want some of the benefits that go with movement of goods and services and also capital, at the political end, the movement of people is a touchy subject. And the customs union is similarly split. So it deals with the movement of goods which are in free circulation. In other words, they aren't under customs control. They can move freely around between member states. So there isn't any customs clearance process at each border. So trucks can move from Coventry to Cologne without stopping. It means we work with a common tariff for goods imported from outside the European Union, but we don't have tariffs for trade between the European Union states. But also that we work with a common commercial policy. Now, that meaning that Brussels at the moment and the EU generally dictates what the UK's economic policy is in relation to international trade, and also that the EU has the capacity to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries, and that's something that the Brexit proponents are very much against. So the UK in general, the UK political element, is in favour of some aspects of the customs union against others, as with the single market. So what does this look like at the practical level? Well, think of it in three main areas from my perspective. Matilda will talk about others in a moment, but I'm looking at this in three main topic areas. So customs clearance for movements within Europe, tariffs for movements within Europe, and also documentary and regulatory issues for movements and transactions with Europe. So we'll look a little bit more at all of those. Next slide, please. So once we leave Brexit, and assuming that we don't continue in a status quo requirement, almost all of the practical solutions will result in us having some form of customs formalities when goods move to and from the European Union. Even if you look at agreements such as the Norwegian agreement, the agreement that Norway has with the European Union, which gives them access to the single market, goods exiting and entering Norway to and from this European Union still have to go through a customs clearance process, and that involves a delay, it involves an administrative cost and a financial cost for traders. So that is almost certain to be a feature of the future relationship with the European Union. What form that will take within that framework remains to be negotiated, but it's very likely we will have some form of customs formalities. And when we talk about delays and impact for traders, whether you're talking about cost or whether you're talking about delays, quite often it tends to be small traders and small consignments that tend to get proportionally hit. So for instance, at the moment, a company that's importing shoes from Spain will have the transport cost to bring goods from Spain to the UK. They won't have any duties, they won't have any customs clearance costs. After Brexit, they will almost certainly have to have some form of customs formalities, whether or not they're going to be import duties, and that will have a cost in itself. And for low value transactions, the cost will be proportionally higher as a proportion of the value of the transaction and the profit margin. So the government's looked at this and they've promoted two possible options as part of the negotiating process with the European Union. So one of these is what's known as the highly streamlined customs arrangement between the UK and the EU. Now this is a more pragmatic solution, if you like. They recognise that there will be some form of customs clearance, both when goods arrive in the UK from the European Union, and also when they leave the UK to go to the European Union, and when they arrive in the European Union after leaving the UK. So they recognise that there will be customs formalities, but they're trying to minimise the impact of these, and they've made some practical suggestions to the European Union as to how that works. So that will be things like sharing data and intelligence with the European Union governments and customs organisations, using IT systems to minimise delays at the actual port, so things like number plate recognition, cameras, etc., to allow vehicles to move but still be monitored. They're also talking about simplifying customs procedures to reduce the level of interventions at the borders. And this is interesting because it will be very important to minimise the formalities and to take the formalities away from the border points, which are recognised choke points, whether we're talking about Dover and the Channel ports, or whether we're talking about the land border across Ireland. So they've suggested a number of simplifications. These are very theoretical at the moment, so it's very difficult to say exactly what impact, what they will look like and what impact they will have, but there are suggestions and they're on the negotiating table. One of the options that has also been discussed there is using the concept of authorized economic operator as a benchmark for simplification. So any businesses that have been looking at authorized economic operator as a possibility, it's worth revisiting that because I think it will have significance in the years ahead. The other customs partnership that the government's keen to discuss is hopefully, well, from my perspective, a more wishful thinking prospect. It's basically trying to replicate most of what we've got at the moment within the single market and the customs union, but without the other commitments that go with the single market and the customs union that we saw in the last slide. At a personal level, I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical about how viable that is, both in terms of it being acceptable to the EU member states, but also being legally and viable in a regulatory and legal way. So I think if I was a betting man, my money would be on the first of those options, which involves customs formalities of some sort. Thank you. Next slide. So I mentioned the second aspect of it, tariffs. So we may have customs clearance processes, but we don't necessarily have to have import tariffs for trade between the European Union and the EU member states. If there is no settlement, there would be tariffs, and the tariffs that would apply, generally speaking, if you're as an exporter, if your goods are sold into the European Union, are the same tariffs that apply in Europe today. And you can find out what those tariffs are if you're an exporter by going either to the UK customs tariff or to the European equivalent, which is known as TARIC, T-I-R-I-C. In terms of UK tariffs on goods imported from the European Union, in theory, once we leave and we're not bound by the European tariffs, we have the freedom to change our tariffs, to reduce them or increase them. But whatever changes we make would also have to apply for all imported goods, whether they come from the European Union or whether they come from other countries, unless we settle on some form of free trade agreement with the EU. Worth also just reminding ourselves, because we're talking about goods here a lot, service sectors are liable to lose out because they potentially may lose access to the services agreement, which allows UK companies to sell services and provide services across the European Union. And there's been a lot of focus there on the UK financial services and banking industry as a result of something called the Financial Services Passport, which is a big benefit, which, if it's negotiated as part of a settlement, will undoubtedly have a very big price to pay. So that will be part of the negotiating process. So it's hoped that there will be some sort of settlement, but what will that settlement look like? Well, the smart money at the moment seems to be around some sort of settlement that's based on a free trade agreement, whether it's an existing model, such as the recent Canadian EU free trade agreement, or another model that's out there. Again, recent weeks people have talked about Ukraine, the EU agreement with the Ukraine as the basis for it. A couple of things worth bearing in mind on that. First of all, in terms of tariffs, free trade agreement terms generally tend to only grant relief from import duties if goods adhere to rules of origin. So in other words, for trade between the UK and the EU, the tariff benefits might be restricted to those goods which can be proved to be either of UK or EU origin. So if you're in the business of importing goods from outside the EU and selling them across Europe, you may not be covered by that tariff-free benefit. And even if you are, you may have to prove that your goods originate in the UK or EU in some way, even in the form of a customs declaration or a documentary form, which we'll touch on in a moment. And also worth bearing in mind, a free trade agreement can be personalised. It can be negotiated between two parties to include whatever those parties do want. But all of the free trade agreements that have been signed in recent years by the EU don't come close in terms of services to the agreement that we currently have within the single market. So it seems almost certain that there will be some loss of ability to sell services through a negotiated free trade agreement type settlement. So my advice there would be to start looking at the possible implications, look at other free trade agreements if you're selling services, look what's included in trade agreements like the Canadian one, which is the most recent one to have been settled. If you're selling goods, consider the possibility that goods might be subject to tariffs and that you need to check whether your goods are EU origin or UK origin, because you may not be included in that agreement if they're not. Thanks, next slide. The other aspect of it, and potentially this has more of an impact than customs and tariffs, is the documentary and the regulatory issues. Many industries have very specific regulatory requirements, and many of those don't apply at the moment for trade between us and the EU, simply because we already comply with those. So food and drink industries, cosmetics, pharmaceutical industry, they have to prove that the goods meet certain standards. But by dint of being manufactured in the EU and adhering to EU law, they don't have to provide that evidence. But once we leave, sorry, we seem to have slipped slides. Yeah. Once we leave and that can't automatically be assumed, then companies that are in those sectors may have to provide that evidence. And it's not enough for us simply to have identical standards with the European Union countries. As part of to make it worth having, we have to have an agreement with the EU countries that they will recognise and accept our standards as being equivalent to theirs. So that is a substantial barrier for businesses, for the negotiations to overcome. Even for people who aren't subject to specific documentary regulations, there will be a need to provide documentation, which you don't need to do with the EU. So you'll have to have documents for customs purposes, invoices, maybe proofs of origin. You may have to provide a declaration that the goods are a UK or EU origin. And that in itself will have a cost and an administrative burden for businesses. It means that a lot more companies that don't currently get involved in customs procedures will have to in the future. And the impact of not having documentary processes in place is that there may be checks once goods leave or arrive at the country, and that adds to the spectre of queues at Dover and the Channel ports and across the Irish border. So very important that that's resolved in the settlement. So watch this space for further news on that. Finally, just say a few words for the next slide. Thank you. Just a reminder that the Brexit isn't just an EU issue. Trading with countries beyond the European Union, in theory, shouldn't be affected. We can deal with China in the same way we've always traded with China and the USA and all the other countries. But one of the differences that's likely to apply is that the UK is quite unlikely to be able to have access to the free trade agreements which it currently has access to. So the agreements that have been signed between the EU and various countries. So there is a possibility that any businesses that are doing business with countries that have a free trade agreement and whose business relies on a free trade agreement may lose those benefits. Now, opinions differ on this, and I know some legal opinions of the government have suggested that we may still be able to take access to them. It isn't as simple as that. It has to be negotiated with all the parties. So think about what impact that will have on you and your business selling outside the European Union. Of course, we will be able to negotiate our own agreements, and there have been lots of discussions with countries about starting to the negotiation process, but we can't begin the formal negotiations until 2019. And as you will have read in many times in the media, these do take a long time to come about. So don't expect immediate progress. If you're looking to do business in a country outside the EU, don't sit back and wait for a free trade agreement to be signed. Start looking at it now, start dealing with it now, because the quicker you start getting into the market, the quicker you'll start getting the benefits. And just to close off on the next slide, thank you. Just summarised a few points that I've made here, and these points have been made in the past, but it's worth just reiterating them. So 5 things to think about ahead of Brexit, whichever way the settlement goes. So important for businesses to be familiar with the tariff codes that apply for the products you're selling, because once we leave, once we have customs procedures for goods crossing the borders in and out of Europe, there will be a need to provide that information for customs declaration. So you need to know the tariff codes, look them up now. Once you've done that, you can also look up what the duty rates might be. In the worst case scenario, if there is no trade agreement, what duty rate would your goods attract? What duty rate would you pay when you import goods from the European Union? And as I mentioned before, you can find that either on the UK tariff or on the European Union's equivalent, the tariff, the master tariff for the EU. Bearing in mind the possibility of delays, think about any time-sensitive business that you have as a company, whether that's supplying customers that require fixed time deliveries or that sell in just-in-time scenarios, or whether you're buying goods from Europe that you are then selling into time-sensitive markets. Think about the possibility of disruption and start looking at how you might address that, perhaps by moving your lead times to cope with delays, thinking about possibly setting up a network in a European country to hold stock in a European country to speed through the delivery process without the need for customs formalities from your warehouse in Holland or Germany or wherever. Look at the countries you do business outside the EU and look how much you use a free trade agreement. Some businesses use them a lot. Some businesses get a lot of benefit from them, either in the form of reduced tariffs or access into markets that weren't open to them before. Other people use them less and feel that they're not necessarily a big factor in their business. So your thoughts will vary, but look at it. It may be important. You may not realize the importance of it. Look at markets that you're trading, the countries that you're trading with, out where there are free trade agreements. Check whether you're using the benefit. Check whether you're competing with European companies that will potentially have a lower duty rate for their goods if we don't have access to that free trade agreement in the future. And finally, bearing in mind that a free trade agreement might be tied in with origin, look at what the origin of your goods are. They may be made in Britain, but what's the origin of the components, the raw materials? If you've got goods which are made in the UK but using European raw materials and components, you may not be able to prove that those goods are European origin. This is a complex subject, and it will be covered in other seminars on webinars on a later date. But the quicker you start to look at the origin of your goods and not assume, then the quicker you can start thinking about that. In some case, businesses that we talk to are already looking at their supply chains and perhaps focusing more on UK suppliers to bring in more UK content rather than EU content. And there have been a lot of reports that suggest European manufacturers are doing the same at their end. So start looking at the origin of your goods. It's never too early to start thinking about that. So that's a summary of the points I wanted to raise. Thank you very much for listening. At this note, I'm going to hand straight over to our second speaker, Mathilde, who's going to talk in a more general sense about the implications of Brexit. So over to you, Mathilde.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Mathilde Murphy, and I work for Enterprise Europe Network. And in a nutshell, we are a European Union and Innovate UK funded service. And we were set up to help ambitious SMEs innovate and grow internationally. And we've been doing so in some form or the other since 1987. We have offices in all regions of Europe and also beyond. Next slide, please. So my presentation is focusing on, in particular, on the practical preparations that exporters can look at and at the support available to them, to you. First of all, in terms of the short-term and long preparations, well, is it worth mentioning keep calm and carry on? I think at the moment, this is all we have. What evidence do we have on this? There has not been any major shock observed or announced in the economically. The current economic cycle shows that all major economies in the world are experiencing growth. So the UK has been benefiting from this on top of the low value of the pound. But the economy is showing that inflation is going up. And it is still an uncertain climate. So in this context, it's advisable for exporters to be flexible, to be adaptive and innovative in order to react to whatever will be thrown onto the negotiation tables during Brexit and its effect on international trade and your business. So to add to Mike's point that he's already developed on the preparations, my suggestions would be, first of all, to review your internal processes. So, for example, your accountancy software, your corporate social responsibility policies, your legal contracts. Are you prepared for the changes that Mike mentions in the way you are invoicing or you're paying, so invoicing your clients or paying your EU suppliers? It's very likely that you will need to get updates to your business operations softwares to deal with these customs changes that Mike mentioned. Also, can you think of specific clauses in contracts that will need reviewing? I'm thinking particularly of Incoterms. So they're the terms that define who is responsible for shipping the goods, for instance, when you sell. We don't have the answers about what should be included in them, but just doing a review of these documents, do some scenario planning, categorize the issues. That will help you prepare and save time when we get to know a bit more about what's on the cards. Review your policies. So I'm thinking here your environmental policies, your internal processes. You know, when you have audits, etc. Your certifications, particularly if they are recognized internationally, like ISO, because this will help prove your credentials going forward to your clients, international clients. So we mentioned already standards and CE marking. For instance, your European customers, we still need to see these EU-approved standards and conformity to be able to sell your goods on the EU territories. It's worth also reviewing your company's pool of skills and your recruitment needs. When recruiting, you may want to search for people with experience and knowledge of international trade documentations, also employment law, particularly if you're delivering services or construction work, for example, or exhibition services in Europe. It's likely that companies will need to increase their resources for paperwork and anything administrative tasks relating to international trade. So maybe consider training sessions on export documentations, on customs, on Incoterms, etc. In terms of the legal aspects, for your human resource team or director or person in charge may need to review the contracts of employment that you have. And what about your current EU citizens, employees, and your UK citizens working abroad? Are you finding that they're leaving or they're threatening to leave? Can you support them? Can you find out how they feel about their future? Can you provide any reassurance about their employment status? On this, I'd just like to mention that the agreement that was reached between the UK and the EU on the 8th of December on the rights of EU citizens in the UK and of UK citizens in the EU provides some elements of clarification, but we're still waiting for the detailed explanations on how it will work in practice. So what's been put in the agreement is that EU citizens currently in the UK would be allowed to continue living and working there, and those already in the country who do not yet have permanent residency would be able to acquire it after Brexit. The new status has been named settled status. That's its official name at the moment, but it's still unclear how the registration process will be operated by the Home Office. We're told it will be simple and streamlined. For the UK citizens living in the EU and they're potentially your employees delivering some of your work in your company over there on your behalf, issues like whether their rights are protected if they move from one country to another after the withdrawal date, or even their ability to work cross-border in the EU. These issues have been deferred to the second round of negotiations, which will start in March. And Mike has already mentioned, review your supply chain, consider the worthiness of UK suppliers versus European one or international, or maybe look at further afield, whether it's for diversification or for a complete change, as you may have a higher cost base in euros or other currencies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in terms of safeguarding tips, just to elaborate a bit further, I would suggest it's worth keeping an eye and contribute to any consultations on potential legislation changes. It would also be wise to keep an eye on consultations to change EU laws, because as exporters, you will still need to comply with EU legislation on products. So, for example, we mentioned CE marking, for instance, after Brexit, for your products to be sold on the internal market. There's also, and Mike mentioned it, changes in the sector of services. So the EU, excuse me, the EU is making a priority of making it easier for companies and professionals to provide services in the EU. So in particular, digital services, they've got this view of creating a full digital single market. At the moment, we've got just the single market. So examples of that have been so far abolition of roaming charges, the opportunity to access your downloads and your data outside your country of residence. And we know the UK digital sectors are heavily integrated with global markets. 20% of digital goods and services are exported internationally, and 81% of digital exports are in services. So if you are in the services industry, it's important to keep up to date with these developments and have all the facts to make decisions on your future export prospects in EU countries. The digital single market is estimated at 500 billion euros. That's in addition to the current product single market. And with the UK outside it, UK businesses would not be allowed, for example, to process EU customers' data unless there's a special arrangement. EU citizens therefore might not want to buy UK online services because the only recourse for complaint would be to sue in a UK court, while at the moment they can sue using their national court system. So on this, in the UK, I would say make use of associations for your sector. I mentioned the digital services. So for this sector, one of the trade bodies, Tech UK, for instance, where I took some of the data that I mentioned. They'll be representing your interests, lobbying on your behalf, and they can influence the negotiation talks. In terms of currency awareness, is it worth hedging the currencies that you use when you trade? Is it worth having a euro account? How can you make the most of the weaker pound at the moment? Because if you can make money now, don't delay. This will all be in the bank when times are harder, I suppose. Should you consider opening a branch or an office in another European country? That office could be your EU single market window when trading with EU partners in the future. 40% of the goods we exported in 2015 went to the EU, and 54% of the goods we imported came from the EU. So according to the Financial Times, some EU businesses are moving away from the UK supply chain. So is relocation maybe a way to reassure some of your EU customers, or some partial relocation? And as we know, foreign investment agencies have been on the prowl to attract UK businesses, small and big, to their country, as these two posters, billboards, demonstrate. On the next slide, please. And next slide. So how can we help? Where is there support available for you? So in terms of support, first of all, and in terms of EU trade, the good news is that our services at Enterprise Europe Network, which is an EU-funded project, so we are also affected by these negotiations, and we're also supported by Innovate UK. We're here to stay. We've had positive news from both parties that we will be able to provide services for the next 2-3 years at least. We have over 500 offices in EU member states, so we can still access a wealth of information about our EU neighbour markets in terms of national legislation, market information, but also more importantly to help you find commercial and technology partners, such as distributors, agents, joint venture partners, or suppliers as well. And on this slide, you've got further examples of the type of support we've offered to our clients following their Brexit inquiries, such as, well, finding foreign investment incentives to relocate or to open a branch or subsidiary in another EU country, helping them find a local partner in, for example, Ireland and Germany to set up an office. So, for example, finding a payroll provider, a legal advisor for employment, for example, when they want to employ somebody in a country. We can find information on employment law in the European states, EU standards and CE marking and other regulatory legislation from the EU, and how they are implemented nationally. Sometimes there are slight differences to what the European text. And very important as well, protecting your IP and trademarks in particular. So on this, I just wanted to elaborate a bit more regarding IP and Brexit. If you have an EU trademark, it currently covers you in the UK and in the EU at the moment. But if you don't use it for the EU market, you may be challenged by competitors who want to sell in the EU in the future. The EU trademark may not be valid in the UK, whether you are a UK company or an EU one. And without an agreement, community rights, such as the community designs and the trademarks, will no longer have effect in the UK. And ultimately, the scope of these rights, when they're applied for, will not actually include the UK. And therefore, there remain questions about what will happen to the UK portion of this EU trademark when they've been obtained before Brexit. If the right is reduced in its geographical scope, i.e. the UK is not in it, its value diminishes. And given the economic significance of the UK, that could result in the company that holds these rights to lose out commercially. So as a company, if you rely on these community rights, on these trademarks and design, you need to be able to respond quickly to changes in these areas, and we can help you with that. And in the future, any recognition of these rights will need to be agreed by the UK and the EU as part of the negotiations. Next slide. We also have a growing presence in non-EU countries, and we can facilitate introductions to, again, commercial, technology and research partners in these countries. And that means we can help you grow your exports outside Europe as well. For other aspects of the planning I mentioned in previous slides, such as skills, training, you might want to talk to your local growth hub and chambers of commerce, and of course, make the most of webinars on open to export and other platforms. And of course, your bank and currency specialists can also give specialized advice on getting paid and being a good payer to your foreign suppliers. Next slide, please. Other type of support available. There are, I think it's worth mentioning for some exporters, particularly on the more innovative and R&D focused one, but not only. The UK government has guaranteed EU funding for UK participants to these EU funding projects, where the project application is submitted before the UK leaves the EU and is subsequently approved after Brexit. So there is a lot of EU funding available for R&D and innovation. Please come and speak to us if that's your area of specialty, and we'll help you. And to go further on the subject of innovation and productivity, which is big at the moment, UK support on these topics is ramping up, and it can be accessed by Innovate UK competitions, for example. There is also support from the growth hubs and at regional level in various, also sometimes EU-funded projects under ERDF, for example. From Innovate UK, I thought I'd mention, because it's relevant to international trade, there is a program that has been newly launched to take innovative SMEs to various destinations such as Israel, Canada, USA, Japan, Ireland, and Switzerland. They're sector specific. We've got topics such as cybersecurity, pharmaceuticals, healthy food, autonomous vehicles, new battery technologies, etc. And they're fully funded missions. And it's a pilot for this year, but it's very likely to be extended in forthcoming years. So worth taking advantage of that. And I've put the link on the on my site as well for you to check out. I finally thought I would also give you add some useful resources that I came across in recent weeks. The first one refers to the no deal scenario. They came as a bit of a surprise, actually, these notices. The European Commission issued a number of documents called notices, explaining in detail how things would change in terms of UK trading and legal arrangements in the event of a no deal. We expect that there'll be more published. In fact, since that newsletter was published, there's been another one that has been issued on public procurement, so selling to the public sector in Europe. What would be the status of UK companies doing that? They are sector specific, so will not affect all of the companies listening today. But if you are in the sectors of transport, medical products, biocidal products, if your products are CE marked, some elements of food and drinks, but not all of them, they are worth a check. And again, there's a link there for you to have a look at. They are not listed, unfortunately, in this one single place. So we've referred you to a newsletter document that lists some of them at the moment. But speak to me if you need to reach out if you need more information. The other two refer to the impact of Brexit on intellectual property. That's a complex matter, as I mentioned earlier. So it's important to check your specific situation, review and seek advice. And there's also a checklist that I found on the Financial Times about what companies should do to prepare for Brexit. Next slide, please. So it's worth also mentioning the aspects of trade that will remain the same, because there is a wider context in terms of economic cycles and cultural aspects of trading, and this will not change necessarily because of Brexit. So just a couple of points. The euro and the currency fluctuations. At the moment, there are 19 countries that use it, and these currencies in general are influenced by economical and political situations. So as discussed before, know your options, which could be from wait and see to taking a big leap of faith for an investment based on your attitude to risk. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that your European counterparts, whether they're your clients or your suppliers, they also need to prepare, and they wonder what's going on. So talk to them, work, plan together for alignment. Last October, I think, I was in Lille. I was invited in Lille because the Regional Chamber of Commerce there, they organize quarterly briefings for their members on Brexit. And they invite UK speakers to talk about the issues, and the companies that attend, they really welcome the exchange with UK businesses. They want to know what's going on and how we deal with the situation. So a suggestion to help them, maybe to reassure them, could be to show that you're investing time in getting your voice heard, that you're talking to your representative bodies, and that there is some element of lobbying of the government, that you're familiar with what's happening for your sector. Next slide, please. Another point worth making is if you have patents or inventions. So I'm back on IP here, but on the subject of what will not change. For patents and inventions, the UK has indicated that they will sign the Unitary Patent Court, or UPC agreement, and under this regime, which is supposed to come in force very soon, it was supposed to come to force at the end of last year actually, businesses will be able to protect and enforce their patent rights across Europe in a more streamlined way, with one single patent and through one single patent court. And most of the signatories are EU member states, but it's not an EU court, so that's why it's not really affected, I suppose. But it's not valid, as I mentioned before, for trademarks and design, so please refer to my comments earlier and the intellectual property Brexit page for further information. And finally, on the next slide, please, it's worth keeping in mind the reason why you're running your business and the quality and the attractiveness of your goods and services. So you need to keep at it, and you can hope that the demand will stay. And also the cultural awareness, the good relationship with your clients, the human factor is really important, because people do business with people. But as we've highlighted, it is important to start planning, to make scenarios, and to look at the various options which may take place. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thank you, Mike, as well. It remains a very fascinating topic, and one which we'll continue to cover for certain. And yeah, thank you so much for all that advice. So we're now going to open the floor to a few questions. As mentioned at the start, we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and group these as much as possible. First question in from Larissa and a few others is around businesses located in Northern Ireland, and kind of what is the chance that Northern Ireland is going to have a special customs arrangement after Brexit, and just how do you foresee the border actually happening when the trade deal comes into place? I'm going to put that to Mike first. Mike? Oh. Hello, Mike? Okay.
Beg your pardon, sorry, I thought I'd unmuted myself. People tend to talk about the Irish border as the key point of direct interaction with Europe, but also, of course, the Channel Tunnel is equally valid. But obviously, when you're talking about driving across a road, it will be a major difference. So going back to the comments I made, where there is likely to be some form of customs clearance, that will have to be mitigated. So you're not going to be able to have physical barriers with queues of cars. It will have to be dealt with through technology. that places a difficult situation on both governments of both sides. And there's been lots of talk about the whole island of Ireland being, or certainly Northern Ireland being, a customs zone to facilitate that trade. That seems to hit some political objections, so that may not mean a sort of ongoing possibility for that. This is going to be argued the biggest conundrum, I think, around the whole Brexit process. The UK may well have a great degree of willingness to compromise on this, and the problem being possibly from the EU side, that while they may be keen to progress, they can't compromise their overall customs procedures. If we end up with a settlement that's based around a free trade agreement, that doesn't allow them to simply change their customs procedures, because we would still become a third country, a non-EU country as far as they're concerned. So it places them in a difficult position to have different customs procedures for one non-EU country than all of the other non-EU countries around the world. So I think that is one that is going to have to go to the wire. Hopefully the facilitations and the simplifications that both parties will be able to agree will actually facilitate that non-physical, removing of physical barriers to allow it to happen. But I think that is arguably the most difficult trade-related aspect of the negotiations.
Thank you, Mike. Next question we've had a few questions in around export licenses and controls. I guess in a general sense, Mike, how do you see these going? Kind of what will people need to be wary of here?
Okay, well, at a regulatory aspect, the legislation that we have in the UK is a combination of domestic UK law on export controls and also EU legislation. So, for instance, it affects us in various ways, and some people that deal in that type of product will be aware of, if you have goods which are dual-use goods, and you're selling to a company based in the EU, if they're going for local consumption in the EU, they don't need an export license, whereas if you're selling to a business outside the EU, they do. Now, once we leave, and assuming we leave the single market and the EU becomes a third country, theoretically export licenses would be needed for trade with the EU. But what I would see happening is some form of either simplification. If there is no negotiated agreement that covers this, then there'll be some sort of simplification in the form of a general export license, an open general export license, which again people may be familiar with, which is a low level of controls which simply allows people to do it provided they monitor the sales. Some areas it won't change. So, for instance, some goods already need an export license to sell into the European Union, so that won't change. Another aspect that will change, though, is as well as UK export open general export licenses, there are some EU equivalents which we can also take advantage of, and which will fall away once we leave the EU. But again, that's something that's within the power of UK government to correct by putting in new domestic open general licenses to replace those. So there will be a regulatory change. It's hopefully unlikely to be significant. The big issue will be whether we will have some sort of license for EU trade going directly into those markets, and what form it will take. So again, watch this space as with everything else.
Cool, thank you. And the next question might be one for Mathilde. It's just around platforms like the EU's market access database. This seems as though it's going to be one of the topics of discussion. What advice would you give for companies in terms of accessing that after Brexit, or kind of where do you think there'll be access to it, and what other databases are there out there?
Yes, unfortunately, as far as we think, they're not accessible for countries, for people who are not in the EU, even with clever computer systems that recognize the IP, etc. So it's a bit of a tricky one. I don't think there is really any equivalent at the moment. Whether the UK will develop something copying it or negotiate something with the EU to be able to access it, or yes, have something similar. We don't know. So I would suggest that, again, you might want to consult with trade associations and lobby for that, lobby the government as well, ask them what will be available for you to to check, because they are really valuable databases. We use them all the time as advisors here. So yes, it's a tricky one, complex one, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you. I'm just gonna try and do two quick questions. Obviously, we're running a little bit over shortly, but first one is around AEO. Mike, you mentioned it towards the start. Um, This is from Robert Lawley, and he asks, AEO status is good for a company, but does the panel think it's a solution for Brexit proofing a business after the UK leaves the EU? Mike.
It's not going to be a solution in itself, not least because at the moment the UK's only got something like 600 odd companies who are AEOs amongst the hundreds of thousands of businesses that trade with Europe. So once all those 100,000 plus businesses that trade with the EU have to start worrying about customs, they're going to fall into that requirement, and it's not going to be feasible for all of those to become AEOs, even if they all wanted to. So I think AEO is going to be significant, particularly if you are a business that is already an AEO, or if you're thinking about it. This is probably another argument to proceed with an application as soon as possible, because the government has already said that AEOs will be first in the line to get simplifications and facilitations, which will make a difference to you whether you're importing from or exporting to the EU. So it's been said already that that is going to be a factor, but it isn't going to be the answer to everybody's prayers to solve queues at Dover and across the Irish border, unfortunately.
Thank you. And one last question. This is from Helen and a couple of others as well. Is there too much emphasis being placed on the importance of free trade agreements, and how useful is a free trade agreement to an ordinary British SME? Mike, do you want to speak to that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, free trade agreements are a little bit of a Marmite subject. People either really appreciate them and benefit from them, or they don't. Some people profit from them in form of reduced tariffs, which can make a big difference in making your price competitive in an overseas market. Other people don't bother, either because they can't prove that the goods originate, which is a prerequisite to take advantage of it, or because they simply find the administrative barrier. One company I spoke to not a long time ago said, well, if I can't take advantage of free trade agreements, I'll simply drop my prices by 5 or 10% to take advantage of it, or to compensate for it. And that's great if you're selling a product with enough profit margin that you can afford to drop your prices by 5 to 10%. So it varies for different people as to what extent they can take advantage of it. Sometimes the biggest benefits of trade agreements are not actually around sales of goods. Sometimes it's around opening markets for sales of services. So shouldn't underestimate the benefits of a free trade agreement. But as I mentioned in my presentation, businesses shouldn't rely on a free trade agreement to be the magic key that opens the door to a new market. So if you're looking to do business in a new market, don't sit back and wait for a free trade agreement to make it possible for you. You should be looking at that market now. So it may be a solution towards, a partial solution towards the Brexit negotiations. We may be able to get free trade agreements up and running fairly soon after we leave the EU, but certainly don't sit back waiting for it to happen.
Thank you, Mike. And on that note, we have slightly overrun, so I'm going to wrap it up now. So thank you once again to Matilda and Mike for today, and I hope everyone's found that all really useful. And even if it remains a slightly speculative area of discussion, I hope people are able to take something away from today, at the very least.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to draw your attention to the checklist that Mike and Matilda drew up following last year's Brexit webinar. Given that the landscape is unlikely to change immediately within 2018, this 12-point checklist should remain a useful starting point for coming up with a strategy for preparing for Brexit. It's available on the site for you to look at and can be found at openexport.com/article/preparing-Brexit-checklist. As mentioned at the start, Mike does indeed run the post-Brexit workshops for the Institute. So if you'd like to go into more detail about how your business can prepare, I definitely recommend looking into signing up to one of these. They usually take place in one of the major cities, and more details can be found at export.org.uk/post-Brexit planning. As mentioned, our next webinar is on VAT. Again, that's another topic which might be affected by Brexit. That takes place on February 13th, and you can find more details about that session and all our plans for 2018 more generally at open-to-export.com/webinars. As always, please take our exit surveys to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us any suggestions for improvements or future topics. Many thanks for now. Goodbye.